My husband died before he could see the world he dreamed of, so I packed his ashes to take his soul on one final journey. Make sure you subscribe because you won't believe how this last goodbye proved he was with me every step of the way. My name is Eleanor. For 47 years, my husband Richard was the sound in my quiet life. The cheerful whistle from his workshop, the low rumble of his laugh during the evening news, the steady rhythm of his breathing beside me in the dark. 3 months ago, that sound stopped. And in its place, a silence so vast and profound settled over our little house that I sometimes felt I would drown in it. Grief, I've learned, isn't a single event. It's a series of quiet, empty spaces. His armchair by the window, still holding the faint imprint of his shoulders, his muddy gardening boots, which I can't bring myself to move from the back porch, the second coffee cup I still instinctively take out of the cupboard every morning. He was a good man, a man of simple needs and one enormous, unfulfilled dream. Yesterday, while clearing out the top of his closet, a space filled with his old flannel shirts that still smelled faintly of him, I found it, his atlas. It wasn't a fancy globetrotter's map, just a heavy, well-worn book with a faded blue cover, its corners soft from decades of handling. I sat on the floor and opened it across my lap. Every page was a testament to his secret life of wanderlust. He had circled cities in vibrant red ink, traced shipping routes across oceans, and filled the margins with his neat, aspirational handwriting. See the lions at dawn, Serengeti. Hear the echo in the Grand Canyon. Taste real pasta in Rome. It was a life he had planned to live someday. But someday never came. There were always diapers to buy, braces to pay for, college tuitions to save for. Our children, our beautiful, demanding children, were his world, and he never once complained. But here, in this book, was the silent proof of the world he had sacrificed. On the last page, in handwriting that was shakier, from just a few years ago, was his final entry. The Scottish Highlands. The place where the mountains meet the sea, with my Ellie. A hot tear splashed onto the page, blurring the ink. In that moment, a new kind of resolve, fierce and clear, cut through the fog of my grief. If he could not go to the world, I would bring the world to him. I picked up the phone and called our daughter, Sarah. She's a high-powered lawyer in the city, always busy, always closing a deal. "Hi, honey," I began, my voice thick with emotion. I explained my idea, to take her father's ashes on one last trip to see the places he had dreamed of. There was a pause on the other end, filled with the faint clicking of a keyboard. "Mom, that's a very sweet thought," she finally said, her voice kind but distracted. "But it's a bit much, isn't it? I'm absolutely swamped this quarter. I can't possibly get away. Maybe just a small service here?" I understood. I did. Her world was one of deadlines and depositions, not of old maps and final wishes. But a part of me, a small, selfish part, had hoped she would see the poetry in it. "Of course, dear. I understand," I said, my voice brighter than I felt. We hung up, and the silence in the house rushed back in, heavier than before. I stood alone in the quiet house, the worn atlas in my hands, holding my husband's unfulfilled dream. My daughter didn't understand, and the world suddenly felt vast and frightening. But I looked at the small, elegant urn on the mantelpiece and knew I had to do this. I did not yet realize that this journey would be not just a farewell, but a conversation with his soul, and that he had left me clues for every step of the way. The weeks leading up to the trip were a strange dance of logistics and emotion. There were moments of paralyzing fear, where the sheer scale of what I was about to do threatened to swallow me whole. An old woman traveling the world alone. It sounded like madness. But then I would look at the urn on the mantelpiece, a handsome box of dark walnut that I'd chosen because Richard had always loved the feel of real wood, and the fear would subside, replaced by a quiet, steady purpose. This wasn't for me. It was for him. Booking that first plane ticket to Paris felt like stepping off a cliff. My hand trembled as I clicked the confirmed button on the computer screen. For nearly 50 years, every trip, every plan had been a we. This was the first time I had ever typed my name, singular, into a travel itinerary. It felt like a betrayal and a liberation all at once. Paris was exactly as beautiful and as overwhelming as Richard had described it from his books. The city buzzed with a romantic energy that made my solitude feel sharp and acute. My first day, I felt like a ghost drifting through the vibrant streets, an invisible observer to a world of lovers and life. I found a small sidewalk cafe, the kind Richard had underlined in one of his travel magazines. I sat at a tiny wrought iron table, and out of pure, ingrained habit, I placed my handbag on the empty chair beside me to save his seat. The absurdity of it, the phantom limb of a half-century-long routine, almost made me get up and leave. But I didn't. Instead, I took a deep breath, reached into my bag, and placed the small walnut urn gently on the seat. It was discreet, heavy, with a significance no one else could see. "Well, Richard," I whispered to it, my voice barely audible over the chatter of the city. "We're here." That's when everything changed. I began to travel not as one, but as two. I was his eyes, his narrator. At the Louvre, I stood before the winged victory of Samothrace, just as he'd wanted, and described the power and the grace of the stone to the silent urn in my bag. I pulled out the tattered atlas and read his notes scribbled next to the museum's entry. "Imagine the history these walls have seen, Ellie." And I did. I imagined it with him. I walked the bridges over the Seine at sunset, bought a warm croissant from a small boulangerie because he'd always loved the smell of baking bread, and sat for hours in the Luxembourg Gardens, simply watching the world go by. I wasn't a lonely widow anymore. I was a woman on a mission, a pilgrim carrying a sacred trust. The journey was no longer about his absence. It was about his enduring presence. Paris had been a city for two, and I had been alone, or so I'd thought. Slowly, on its ancient streets, I learned that I wasn't just carrying his ashes, I was carrying his spirit. But as I boarded the next flight, the note of triumph in my heart was mingled with a new apprehension. The next destination on his map, the wild, unpredictable plains of Africa, would be a test of a different kind, one that would challenge whether I was truly ready for the raw, untamed world he had so longed to see. Leaving the elegant, structured beauty of Paris for the vast, untamed wilderness of the Serengeti was like stepping from a perfectly composed painting into a raw, unpredictable epic. The air in Tanzania wasn't scented with perfume and pastries. It smelled of dry earth, wild sage, and the distant, thrilling promise of rain. Everything was bigger here. The sky, the horizon, the silence. If Paris had taught me how to be with Richard in a crowd, Africa was about to teach me how to be with him in the overwhelming presence of nature itself. I felt completely out of my element. A widow from Ohio in a safari jeep, bouncing along a dusty track with my husband's ashes safely tucked in my day pack. It was absurd. It was magnificent. The first time I saw a herd of elephants moving with slow, silent grace across the plains, their ancient, wrinkled skin bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, I felt a sense of awe so profound, it left me breathless. I found myself whispering to Richard, describing the scene, my voice filled with the childlike wonder he had always possessed. His entry for this place in the atlas was simple: where the world began. I was finally beginning to understand what he meant. The days were filled with incredible sights: a pride of lions sleeping in the shade, a lone giraffe silhouetted against a baobab tree, the dizzying sea of wildebeest on their great migration. But it was the nights that truly changed me. One evening, I sat alone on the small porch of my tented lodge, 1,000 miles from everything I had ever known. The sun had bled out across the horizon, leaving behind a sky of impossible, velvety blackness, punctured by the most brilliant spray of stars I had ever seen. The sounds of the night were a symphony of the wild: the chirping of insects, the distant whoop of a hyena, the low grunt of something large moving in the tall grass nearby. There was no fear, only a profound sense of peace. I looked up at the unfamiliar constellations, and a memory, sharp and vivid, washed over me. It was from a summer night nearly 50 years ago. Richard and I were young, broke, and lying on a cheap blanket in the small backyard of our first home. He had a library book about astronomy, and he was pointing out the stars to me, his voice filled with passion. "That's our sky, Ellie," he'd said. "But it's only half the story. One day, I'm going to take you south of the equator and show you the other half. I'm going to show you the Southern Cross." A tear slid down my cheek, hot in the cool night air. I looked up at the blazing river of the Milky Way, so much brighter here than I had ever seen it. I found the Southern Cross, a small, perfect kite of stars hanging in the darkness. He had kept his promise. Or rather, he had led me here to fulfill it for the both of us. In that moment, under the immense, star-dusted African sky, my husband had never felt more alive. I carried the peace of that night with me for the rest of my time in Africa. It was a deep, internal warmth, a quiet certainty that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The journey was no longer just about fulfilling Richard's dream. It was about discovering a strength in myself I never knew I possessed. Before leaving the Serengeti, I had arranged to make a long-distance call home from the main lodge office, a complicated process involving a crackling line and an operator with a sing-song voice. I needed to hear my daughter's voice. When Sarah picked up, her familiar, hurried, "Hi, Mom," sounded different, even across the thousands of miles of static. It was softer, less rushed. "I got the photographs you sent," she said, and for once I didn't hear the clicking of a keyboard in the background. "The one with the elephants and the sunset over the plains. Mom, it's just incredible." I smiled, my eyes closing, as I pictured her in her sleek modern office, a world away, looking at a picture of a timeless landscape. "It is, honey. Your father would have loved it." "I know," she said, and her voice was quiet, thoughtful. "I've been thinking about that a lot, about him. I was in a client meeting yesterday, all spreadsheets and projections, and my mind just drifted. I thought about Dad and how he worked his whole life dreaming of places like this. And I thought about you actually being there. You're so brave, Mom." It wasn't an apology. It was more than that. It was understanding. It was a bridge being built across the chasm that had opened between our two worlds. We talked for a few more minutes, not about her work or my travel logistics, but about him. We shared a memory of a family vacation to the lake, a small story we hadn't spoken of in years. It was a short call, but it was one of the most important conversations we'd ever had. I hung up the heavy receiver feeling lighter than I had in months. My journey was no longer a solitary act of remembrance. It was sending ripples back across the ocean, touching the heart of my daughter, reminding her of a legacy of dreams that was hers, too. It gave me a new sense of purpose. I wasn't just doing this for Richard anymore. I was doing it for us, for our family. My daughter's voice had changed, and I knew my journey was touching more than just me. But ahead lay the last, most important point on the map, the place we had chosen together, its name circled in the atlas with a heart beside it. I didn't know if I would have the strength I needed for the final farewell that awaited me there. The final flight, the one to Scotland, was different. There was no apprehension, only a sense of solemn purpose, like a river flowing inevitably to the sea. The Scottish Highlands were exactly as Richard had described them from the pages of his books. Epic, moody, and achingly beautiful. The air was sharp with the scent of sea salt and damp earth. Gray clouds hung low over mountains that seemed to weep with small, silvery waterfalls. This wasn't a place of sunny, easy joy like Paris, or of raw, untamed life like the Serengeti. This was a place of deep, ancient memory, a fitting stage for a final act. His atlas had a map of the Isle of Skye, and on it, a single, decisive red circle around a niced point. His note beside it was simple: the edge of the world, our spot. I hired a car, a small, sputtering thing that seemed dwarfed by the landscape, and drove for hours on narrow, winding roads until I reached the coast. The walk out to the point was long, a winding path across rolling green hills that ended abruptly at a sheer cliff, a dramatic finger of land pointing out into the churning Atlantic. The wind was a living thing here, whipping my hair across my face and trying to steal the breath from my lungs. I found a sheltered spot amongst the rocks, just as the map in the atlas had indicated, with a perfect view of the lighthouse and the endless gray sea. This was it. Our spot. I laid out a small tartan blanket I had bought in the village, the wool rough against my hands. I placed the walnut urn in the center of it. For my bag, I took out a faded photograph of our wedding day, two impossibly young people squinting in the sun, full of foolish, beautiful certainty. And finally, I took out a letter, the paper crisp and new. I had written it the night before. "My love," I began, my voice carried away by the wind almost as soon as I spoke the words. But it didn't matter. I knew he could hear me. I spoke for hours. I told him about the journey, about the lions and the stars, and the taste of a Parisian croissant. I recounted our life together, the small, silly moments that build a marriage. The time he tried to fix the plumbing and flooded the kitchen, the nights we'd stayed up with a sick child, the quiet Sunday mornings reading the paper in bed. I thanked him for his patience, for his strength, for giving up his world for our family. Finally, I unfolded my letter. My voice was shaky now, tears blurring the words on the page. It was a letter of farewell, a letter of gratitude, and a letter of promise. A promise that I would live the rest of my days, not just in memory of him, but with the strength and curiosity he had gifted me. I stood on the edge of the world, in the place from our shared dream, the urn with his ashes heavy in my hands. There was one last, most difficult step to take. And in that moment, as if on cue, the heavy gray clouds that had covered the sky all day began to part. A single brilliant shaft of golden sunlight broke through, illuminating the sea and the cliffs in a breathtaking, otherworldly glow. And in that light, for a fleeting second, I saw the silhouette of a soaring seabird, a gannet, maybe, catch the sun on its wings, looking for all the world like a piece of his soul, finally free. It was the sign I didn't know I needed, the proof that he had been with me all along. With the warmth of the sun on my face and a newfound peace in my heart, I opened the walnut box. I had expected the ashes to feel gritty, a sad, terrestrial substance. But in my hands, they felt more like fine, silvery dust, like fallen stars. I held them for a moment, a lifetime of love and memories cradled in my palms. Then I extended my hands and let the wind take them. They didn't fall. They soared. Caught by the powerful Atlantic gust, they danced in the golden sunlight, a swirling, glittering cloud that rose up and out over the sea, disappearing not into the gray water below, but into the vast open sky. I watched until the very last speck vanished from sight. I wasn't losing him, I was releasing him. His soul was finally seeing the world, becoming a part of the wind, the sea, and the light he had so longed to witness. I stood on that cliff for a long time, not crying, but smiling. The journey home was quiet. When I walked back into my little house, the silence that greeted me was different. It was no longer the hollow, aching silence of absence. It was a gentle, peaceful quiet, filled with the echoes of Parisian streets, the roar of African lions, and the whisper of the Scottish wind. The house was no longer a monument to my grief. It was a gallery of our shared adventure. Richard was everywhere, not as a ghost, but as a joyful memory. A week later, there was a knock on the door. It was Sarah. She looked tired, her corporate armor nowhere in sight. In her hands, she held a large, beautifully framed picture. "Mom," she said, her voice soft, her eyes filled with a sincerity I hadn't seen in years. "I'm so sorry. I was wrong. I was so caught up in my own stress, my own world. I didn't understand what you were doing. But seeing your pictures, hearing your voice on the phone, it was the most beautiful, loving tribute I could ever imagine." She handed me the frame. It was a large, antique map of the world. A single, delicate red thread was pinned across it, tracing the impossible journey I had taken from our small town to Paris, to the Serengeti, and finally to that wind-swept cliff on the Isle of Skye. I hugged my daughter, a real, heartfelt hug that seemed to mend the small fractures that had grown between us over the years. "Next year," she said, pulling back, a small smile on her face, "on the anniversary, let's go back to Scotland, together, to visit Dad." And in that moment, my heart felt completely whole. Richard's final journey was over, but ours, a new one, born from his memory and forged in the fires of grief and love, was just beginning.